Hello everybody, this is day 1 of me playing chess on chess.com until I reach the rapid rating of 2500. So my current rating is around mid 1900s and I will almost all the time play the 10-minute rapid game here on chess.com. So here we go, 10 minutes. I won't talk as much as I would, but okay, we're playing against a mid 1900 player as well. E4, E5, knight F3 attacking the E5 pawn, and this is the Ruy Lopez chess opening. D6 is not the best because I can play D4. Now bishop D7 is forced, knight C3. I will pre-move a bit because this is a 10-minute game. And now I believe bishop G5 is the best move. Of course, taking is not really good. Bishop E7, I will simply castle. Castling is now the best, I believe. And we have a game, but this is not the best. Because after he takes back, I can take back with the queen. Or maybe he will take back with the knight. But then I have bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and I can take with the queen. So bishop takes e7, and now queen takes d4, of course pressuring the g7 pawn. Okay, he castles. And now probably something like rook to e1 is the best, trying to play for e5 pawn break, so rook e1. Maybe knight to d5 was good as well, but of course after queen d8 my knight is not really good because after c6 it would get kicked away. So what is my opponent thinking about? Probably rook to e8 is the best move, and this is pretty balanced endgame for the first day of me playing chess until 2500 rated on chess.com, of course. So my opponent is burning quite a lot of time in the beginning, and my plan is pretty simple. I will play rook d1 next and e5 if allowed, but of course this knight is very strong here, so maybe f4 followed by e5 is a very good plan here. But my opponent is still thinking. Of course, time advantage is very important because there is no increment in 10-minute games. And I will play as fast as I possibly can. And of course, this is pretty easy position to play. Knight d5, maybe c4, and then back. Of course, controlling the d5 square is really important here. Maybe c5 here is good, but then this d6 pawn is a bit of a weakness, and after something like queen d3, rook d1, this d6 pawn will be weak, so c5 cannot really be played. But what is my opponent thinking about? Maybe he will play knight to f6, pressuring the pawn, but then e5 is very strong move, opening up the center, and my rook is already on the e-file, which is very important. So probably knight f6 is not very good, because after e5, as I mentioned, center opens up, and this should favor me, but c5 is not playable either. Probably c6 is the best, but then this pawn is weak as well, and after something like rook d1 I will have good position, but my opponent plays the move rook to e8, which is very good. But now I can play knight to d5, there is queen to d8 maybe. Yes, this is not very good for me, so maybe just rook d1. Maybe f4 is good as well, but of course rook d1 has to be very good move, pretty much very solid move, just putting this rook on the semi-open d-file, and now c5 cannot be played because d6 pawn would be hanging, of course. a6, this is probably a waste of time, he's trying to play b5, but I don't think this is very good because after knight d5 this pawn will be weak. Now maybe f4 and e5 is nice, but if he takes, then the knight is hanging here, so f4 maybe. f4, I don't think it is too risky, if I'm honest. If knight f6, wow, what? This pawn is now completely free? What is my opponent seeing? If he takes, I take back, the knight is hanging, knight f6, e5, No, this pawn is completely free now. There is no queen takes e4 because the pawn is defended 2 times. Just pre-moving. Rook takes d6, yes, but now I play e5 and I think my position is very close to being winning here. Because now knight g4 is the only move in the position, and after h3, knight h6. Oh, he goes knight h5, excuse me. Okay, maybe this is better, but I don't really believe him. Just g3. He has the idea of f6, but I have the idea to push my pawn as far as I can, of course, and my rooks on the 7th rank will be really good, of course. These pawns are bad, and this knight will come into the action, maybe via knight e4 or via knight d5 to c7 or even b6. And this knight is pretty much out of the game. Probably g6 is the best, knight g7 and then knight to e6. But this takes a lot of time and I will be able to maybe push e6 or put my knight on c7, forking 2 of the rooks. And of course this knight on d5 would be amazing piece, going to b6, going to c7 as well. And I have pretty big time advantage, 2 minutes, my opponent is down to 6 minutes, I have 8 of them. And I think my position is close to being winning. I have an extra pawn, this e-pawn is close to promoting, so f6 is never an idea. And this knight is very badly placed here on h5. Maybe king g2, king f3 and g4 is an idea as well, because this knight is absolutely trapped. So g6 will have to be played no matter what. Oh, now g5 is played. Wow, this is really surprising to me, because I can just take. Ooh, wait, I can play rook h6 now. But then there is knight g7, of course. I didn't see that. But of course I have to take the pawn. There is no other move. Or is it? Knight d5 maybe? Knight d5 of course threatens in some position g4, followed by knight f6 fork. But taking the pawn is pretty much free pawn, I guess. What is his idea? I don't see it. I don't know. Maybe a rook. Yes, but knight g7 is too slow because I have knight to d5, right? This is a crucial resource. Knight d5. If he goes here, I can still check him. And my pawns are completely safe here on e5. And what are you doing, man? This is fork here. I am called Forky Chess and this is fork, of course, so now you have to subscribe. Of course, just kidding, but this is completely winning. This pawn is now hanging, but maybe h4 is good enough to win the game on the spot. So we won our first game. Not yet, but I hope we will win the game. Now the fork is threatened. And now the pawn is about to fall. Maybe king f2 here. If he takes, rook here. Can I just take and this is winning? Well, I'm not so sure. Rook d2, but this is not as winning as I wish it to be. Of course, king f2 has to be the correct move, right? c3, of course, runs into a fork. So king f2 probably is the best. But the pawn just... Or king g2 maybe? No, king f2 has to be better. And now the pawn is about to fall. But I don't really care, I will play rook e2 and after knight to d4 I will play something like... Or maybe after knight c2 I will simply play rook to e4. Good enough. And he's still thinking. Of course, the pawn is free, I believe. Oh, but then I have maybe rook c1? Rook c1? What about rook c1? Knight b4. I take. If he takes, then I have something like rook c7. Takes, I can take, and everything will fall. Maybe rook c1 is the winning idea here. Rook c1. He, of course, cannot really go back because I take and attack the knight. Or is there any fork there? Not really. Rook c1 should pick up a pawn here. Rook c1. But maybe after knight b4 I can play a3. And after a3, of course, there is no fork on d3 because the rook covers the square. There is only move knight c6, and then I can take the pawn. But then the pawn falls anyway. So maybe a3 there is not very good. I must keep pressure on the clock. I can just take right. Most definitely I can. Yes. No doubt about that, because now then I can play rook d7, attack the pawn, and now rook c7 will be followed, and I will simply slaughter him on the 7th rank. Of course, there is no fork because of the rook, and probably knight a2 is the only reasonable idea here to try to hold on to this position. But of course, I have 2 extra pawns, and if he takes the a2 pawn, then I will be only up a pawn. But of course, I am an exchange up as well. I have a rook for the knight, which is winning in a lot of positions with the pawns still on the board. But of course, a rook and king versus knight and king is simply a drawn position. So I cannot trade all the pawns from the board. So knight e2 is probably the only good move here. Maybe knight c6 is an idea as well, but then rook d7, and if knight e5, then I can pick up this pawn. Oh no, I can't because there is fork on d3. I still need to be kinda careful, but I can probably trade off everything into a completely winning rook endgame. After knight c6 I can just take the knight, and if he takes the pawn I can take the pawn on a6, winning the game on the spot with these 2 connected passed pawns promoting on a8 or on b8. So my opponent is still thinking. He only has 2 minutes and a half left, and knight a2 is probably the only good move. But you cannot leave after the game will be ended. I will analyze the game for you, and my opponent is disconnected and he will auto resign in 20 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, 21 seconds left to my first win. And I will gain 11 rating points, and this was pretty clean game because he played this very awkward move after f4. I was trying to play e5, but my opponent simply decided to play c5 and then traded off, and I went on to winning the game. He missed this crucial fork on f6, and I won my first game on my road to 2500 here on chess.com. So I played e4, and you can see here the engine lines. e5 is of course the best move, and after knight f3, knight c6, I like to play bishop to b5. This is the Ruy Lopez. Of course, after bishop b5, I'm kinda threatening to take the knight and then take the pawn, which is not really true because he can take back with the d pawn and have this idea with queen d4 fork. Once again, I'm Forky Chess. You should subscribe. This is a fork. So here after move bishop b5, there are many options. a6 is the best move and the main line. There is also the Berlin defense, and d6 is known as the Stein's defense, of course defending the e5 pawn. but now you can see that this knight is pinned to the king on e8, which can be sometimes very dangerous. And I am taking advantage of this pin. After the move d4, I'm threatening to play d5, and so there is the best move is to take the pawn, but there is also bishop d7 right away. And after d5, knight e7, I play bishop d7, queen d7, but I have a lot of space in the center, so taking the pawn is the best. And after he takes d4, knight takes d4, he played the move bishop d7, the only good move. Now knight c3 is the best, and you shouldn't really be taking this knight if you are black, but knight to f6 was perfectly fine. And now the theory goes bishop g5 if I'm not mistaken. Now bishop e7, I think it is okay. I simply castled, and my opponent took the knight, which I don't believe is the very best move, because after bishop d7, excuse me, queen takes d7 was the best. Okay, now after knight takes d7, which is a slight inaccuracy, I believe, I have the move bishop d7, bishop e7, excuse me, queen e7, and now I finally recaptured the knight from d4, and this queen is very good, pressuring both g7 and a7, and c5 is really not an idea because the d6 pawn would be hanging, but my opponent simply castled. I played the move rook e1, maybe knight d5 was better by the computer, but okay, now he played rook f8, I simply developed, and he played a6, which was kinda bad because the computer says that I have knight d5, but after knight d5 there is queen d8, of course the fork was threatened, and now simply b3 trying to play c4. Okay, this is logical, trying to, of course, have bind on this d5 square. So after the move a6, I decided to play the move f4, trying to play e5, and now my opponent simply blundered. He played the move c5, and the game is pretty much over, because after queen takes d6, everything trades off, and after knight f6, I can simply play e5, knight h5 was a bit of an inaccuracy as well. g3 is of course the only logical move, defending the pawn, and this knight is pretty much out of the game. He will have to play g7, g6 and knight to g7, but he played the move g5, and yes, rook h6 was maybe a bit better after knight g7, not taking this pawn, but of course I took the pawn, which is still completely fine. And after knight g7, I played the move knight d5, threatening the fork here on f6. Another fork, you have to subscribe one more time if you haven't already. And now my opponent blundered knight d6, and I won the game pretty much smoothly here. And of course here he resigned or left the game, because after knight a2 I can play rook c7, the pawns are about to fall, and if you play the move here after rook takes c5, if you play knight c6, I can simply take and winning this pawn no matter what. And of course this is completely winning endgame with the move b3, a3 and b4 in the near future. I'm having an extra 2 pawns, and this position should be winning, so he simply resigned. But of course after a rook takes c4, c5, knight c6, this is not the only move to take the pawn, but of course it is completely fine. So this was my day 1 of playing chess every day until I reach 2500 rating here on chess.com. So if you like the video, make sure to subscribe to follow more such content, and see you guys in another video. Bye!